Chapter 6, Daniel chapter 6, and tonight is our last night in the narrative portion of the book of Daniel. And so we're going to try to tie up this section, and then next week we get to move into the more prophetical sections. But I've mentioned to you a few times throughout this series that I've mentioned some of the various ways that critics have tried to discredit the authenticity and the reliability of the book of Daniel. Last week, I mentioned to you how they used chapter 5 and Belshazzar as an argument against the book of Daniel. And that was an argument for many, many years as to why they believed the book of Daniel was possibly even what they would term a fictitious writing, and that there was no truth to it, and that it was a made-up book. And we saw that archaeology has kind of helped disprove that. We know and we believe on faith what the Word of God says is true, whether archaeology supports it or not. And yet archaeology did come in and support much of what we find has been used against the book of Daniel. Well, this week is no different in that they strike at the mention in chapter 6 of a main character named Darius the Mede. Darius the Mede was first introduced to us last week when Belshazzar was defeated after his party, and they came in, and the Medes and the Persians came in, and the city of Babylon fell, and it was Darius the Mede who took over the kingdom. And the critics have used this person of Darius the Mede as an argument against the book of Daniel. They point out that there is no mention of Darius the Mede outside the Bible. In other words, they say the only time you ever find any record of this person is in the Bible. So for them, that automatically means he must not have existed, right? If the Bible's the only source, well, that's not good enough for them. And so they use that to suggest that Daniel was written much later, that it was written by someone who got confused and used Darius the Persian in what they consider to be a fictitious narrative. Here's the problem. Most of these individuals who do this, who make these arguments, are doing so because they refuse to believe the Bible is true. They refuse to give it the same courtesy that they do other works written at that time. The Bible is the only book that they extend this amount of criticism towards as opposed to any other work. They'll accept all kinds of other works and just take what it says for granted, but when it comes to the Bible, no, if he's only mentioned there, that's not good enough. And so they refuse to do that. So for the Bible scholar, though, we approach the Word of God believing that God said it's true, that what God said is right, and we know it to be true. And so for the Bible scholar and the believer, there are two primary explanations for who Darius the Mede is. One is that Darius, that name Darius, functioned as a title, not as a proper name. So in other words, they would say that term, Darius the Mede, was a title for somebody. Kind of like the way we would think of the title Caesar was a title used by many different people, right? It denoted their position. The other explanation, and by the way, I will say this, they believe that if it functions as a title, they say that it most likely referred to a man named Gubaru, not Goober from the Andy Griffith Show, Gubaru, who served as the governor of Babylon under Cyrus the Great. So Gubaru was one of his military commanders who matches somewhat with what we read in Scripture of this individual. The other explanation for who Darius the Mede is, I believe, is the best explanation, and that is that Darius the Mede is King Cyrus. Darius the Mede and King Cyrus are the same person. And Cyrus was believed, and the reason we can say that, it refers to this person as Daniel the Mede and Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Persian. And understand, Darius is a Median name, and Cyrus is a Persian name. And so ultimately what we're looking at is that Cyrus was believed to have had a Persian father and a a Median mother. Thus, Cyrus was his Persian name, and Darius was his Median name. And by maintaining both names, Darius and Cyrus, it allowed him to more effectively relate and rule the two kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians. Now, if we go back and we even look even in biblical cases, even outside biblical sources, this was a very common thing for a king to use more than one name. In fact, we have it recorded in Scripture, and there is no argument from history and from historical people about it, but we know that one of the kings of Assyrians, he went by the name Pul, P-U-L, and he also went by the name Tiglath-Pileser. So he went by two different names during his reign. This was a common thing. And so I believe because of that, we can confidently approach this passage, and we can trust that it is a real story about a real man who by God's supernatural protection escaped the claws and teeth of real lions so that the nations would know that the God of Daniel is the living God that endures forever. Now, all of that out of the way, in our passage tonight, God is going to bring glory to himself. He's going to do so by rescuing one of his children who was always faithful to him. He's also going to show us there are times and ways to exercise civil disobedience. And it's interesting, we talk a lot about needing more Daniels. And usually when we say we need some more Daniels, we need God to raise up some Daniels, we're always talking about our young people, right? But again, as we mentioned last week, Daniel is in his 80s when we come to this passage tonight. And so Daniel's not just an example for our young people, he is an example for all of us. So when we say we need more Daniels, we need more people to live their life like Daniel, no matter what stage of life they're in. Because Daniel is a perfect example of what it means to be faithful to God from beginning when you're a young man all the way to the end of their life. He is a great example. And so Daniel 6 is going to show us exactly what we need to do to be a Daniel in our modern day Babylon. So that said, let's go ahead and let's begin reading. Let's go ahead and look at Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Daniel 6, verses 1 through 4. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. All right, so we're going to live like a Daniel. Let me share a few principles that we see from the Scriptures this evening. First of all, there we go. To live a life like Daniel means we need to live a life that honors God. We need to live a life that honors God. The events of Daniel 6 take place in relatively short fashion after what we read in chapter 5. Very shortly after he conquers Babylon, Cyrus goes about setting up his kingdom, getting his government affairs set up in the city and nation of Babylon. It was custom during those days for the conquering king to come in and to then choose people from the kingdom he had just conquered and to set those people in positions of authority within the kingdom. Why would he do that? The reason they would do that is because by instilling people he could trust within that kingdom, it gave the people someone they could look to. That's one of our people that's in this position. So it helped to kind of ease the transition from the Babylonian government to the Medes and the Persians. The problem, of course, with doing that is who can you trust, right? If you're going to take people from the kingdom you just conquered and put them in a position of authority, you better make sure you choose the right people, right? And so in Daniel, he found someone who was likely well known by the other nations. Remember, Daniel 5 shows us that he was remembered for his insight, for his intelligence, for his wisdom from when he served as underneath Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he served under Nebuchadnezzar for years and years and years. He was a well-known individual who had ruled well under King Nebuchadnezzar. He had a reputation as a man with an extraordinary spirit, as someone who had within him a spirit of the gods. That was his reputation. And these same descriptions continued to apply to him even into the days of Belshazzar's reign. And so it appears that Cyrus was quite familiar with Daniel before he ever got there. He was familiar with Daniel, he was familiar with his reputation, and when he needed to appoint some people to come in and take charge and to help establish this transition, Daniel was one of those men. Daniel was someone he identified and said, this is a guy that I need to put in charge. And so he puts him into this position of significant leadership in the new kingdom. Well, as we see, Darius, he quickly set up his government with 120 satraps that spanned the kingdom, and over these, he appointed 3 governors, 3 administrators, to make sure that no one tried to cheat and defraud the kingdom. In other words, these 3 governors or administrators, their job was to make sure that there was no government corruption. Wouldn't you like to have that? Have some people in charge of making sure there's no government corruption going on? Nothing has really changed over the many thousands of years of government, has it? We still deal with people and leaders who are corrupt. King Cyrus understood this, so he needed 3 men who could watch all these satraps and make sure that they're not cheating him and that they are not acting in corrupt ways. Daniel, as we noted, is one of these 3 administrators put in this position. He had overseen Nebuchadnezzar's wise men for years, and he had no problem putting Nebuchadnezzar's wise men into their place. So he was a natural choice. But surprise of all surprises, he gets put in this position, and what does he do? He distinguishes himself above all the other satraps, above all the governors. So here it is, Cyrus puts Daniel into place. And just like going all the way back to chapter 1, when they were back in the University of Babylon, and they came out 10 times better than everyone else, Daniel gets put in this position, and he distinguishes himself far better than anyone else that Cyrus puts into position. So much so that the king considers putting him in charge of the whole realm. Can you imagine that just for a moment? That's how good a reputation Daniel, that's the kind of man Daniel was. Here he is in his 80s, and King Cyrus sees he is such a great man that he's willing to consider putting him in charge of not just of Babylon, put him in charge of the whole kingdom. That is trust. That is a special relationship. And so, just as we see back in chapter 1, we see it here again. Daniel is a cut above the rest. He was head and shoulders better than everyone else. So what was the key to Daniel's success? Well, the key to Daniel's success is the same key to our success. We have to, if we're going to live a life that honors God and be successful in that, then that means 2 things. Number 1, we do it by having a right spirit. By having a right spirit. Verse 3 says it was because an excellent spirit was within him. Listen, that was Daniel's testimony throughout his entire life, right? In Daniel chapter 4, verse 8, Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel what? The spirit of the holy God. The queen in Daniel chapter 5, verse 12, reaffirms that. Belshazzar himself, the wicked man he was, he even admits in Daniel chapter 5, verse 14, that Daniel is a man with the spirit of the holy God. Daniel's rise to power had nothing to do with his own abilities. There's nothing special about Daniel. And sometimes we want to lift these people that we read about in the Old Testament. We want to put them on this high pedestal. Listen, there's nothing special about Daniel. He's an ordinary guy who was just committed to his relationship with God. Daniel's position was attributed not because he's the most gifted person. It was given to him because of his spirit. He was a man who walked with God, and it was because of the work of God in his life that he achieved anything he achieved. Daniel understood the principle we see in James 3:17, that all true wisdom comes from above. He was the man God had made him to be. So when he lived out his life, he honored God by having a right spirit. He had a spirit that gave credit to God. He had a spirit that honored God for whatever wisdom, whatever knowledge, whatever abilities he might have. They weren't his, they were from above. And so we understand his spirit was one that was in tune with God, and he gave God all the honor that was due because it was God. He also honored God, secondly, not just by having a right spirit, but by being a faithful servant. He didn't just possess an extraordinary spirit within him. Instead, we see, as the scripture says, he was faithful. As typically happens when someone rises to the top, what happens? Others will try to find some fault to bring them down, right? And when that person reaches the top of the hill, there's always people reaching up to grab him and bring him down. And that is exactly what happens to Daniel here. The other governors and some of the satraps, listen, they don't like Daniel. They don't like how, we might say, they don't like how he looks like he's the teacher's pet, right? Isn't that kind of what we see here? He's the teacher's pet. He's better than everybody else. He's the favored son. He's the one that's getting put up at the top of the chain. And they don't like that, so we got to find some kind of fault. There's got to be some way that we can bring him down a peg or two. And so these governors and these satraps, they search and search, looking for anything that they might be able to use against Daniel. Because after all, listen, you've been around politicians enough, you've seen enough politicians. Every politician has a little bit of dirt on them, right? It seems like it, doesn't it? Show me a perfect politician. Everyone's got a little bit of dirt hidden in the closet, but there's one problem. The Bible says that they could find no charge or fault, nor was there any error or fault found in him. In other words, the more they searched, the more they realized they got a big problem. Daniel always does what he's supposed to do, and he never does what he's not supposed to do. In other words, Daniel is the biggest goody two-shoes in this world. He does everything he's supposed to do. He is the model government employee who just does everything perfectly and does nothing wrong. There was zero corruption in his life, and Daniel was a man who didn't tolerate corruption underneath him. That's the kind of faithfulness he had, and that is the kind of faithfulness we need to exhibit as followers of Jesus. Listen, in his work life, in his life, he was faithful to a fault. Listen, as Christians, we should be model workers and employees. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6 says, "Most men will proclaim each his own goodness, but who can find a faithful man?" Most people are more concerned about building themselves up. But who can find a faithful man? Who can find a man that's more worried about just being faithful and doing the job right? Most people are more concerned about what they can do to advance their own career. Darius found a faithful man in Daniel. Daniel honored God by having a right spirit. He honored God by being a faithful servant in whatever work he was given to do. That's the type of people we need to be. People who have a right spirit that recognize everything we have, everything we do is because of God, and that because of what God has entrusted us with, we will do it to the best of our abilities and be faithful in what he has called us to do. Secondly, not only do we need to live a life that honors God, if we're going to be like Daniel, we need to stay true to God even when it has a cost. We need to stay true to God even when it has a cost. The prophet Ezekiel, in his book, compared Daniel's righteous life with the life of Noah and Job. The events that are about to unfold show us just how justified that comparison was. Daniel's relationship with the Lord, understand, it was not a crisis-oriented faith. Daniel's faith didn't suddenly become real whenever the crisis showed up. Daniel's faith was something that came out of a consistent walk with God that could be seen every single day of his life. So when the emergency, when the crisis popped up, Daniel was already prepared spiritually. He didn't wait for the crisis to make his faith a priority. Instead, he made his faith a priority so that when the crisis came, he was ready. You see, the decision over how to handle the lion's den had been made many years earlier before he ever even heard of the lion's den. He had already counted the cost of what it would mean to stay true to God. To be untrue to his God was never an option for Daniel. It wasn't even up for debate or consideration. And it's here in these next few verses that we see a couple of important truths if we are going to be a people determined to stay true to God. First of all, if we're going to be a people who stay true to God, we have to There we go. We have to realize that godly people will be targeted by the ungodly. Listen, if you're going to live a life for God, there is going to be a cost. Plain and simple. There is always a cost for living faithfully for the Lord. Let's look at verses 5 through 9. Daniel chapter 6, verse 5. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, "King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. You know, I'm not sure why it surprises us or why we are surprised when the world and the devil target us as God's people. Why does it shock us as Christians in general when we come under attack by the world? Go all the way back to Genesis 3:15, and guess what you're going to see? God predicted a continuous hostility between God's people and Satan's. That theme plays itself out throughout the entire Old Testament. And that is exactly what we see happening here in Daniel. Satan and those under the sphere of his influence are in conflict with God. And they will remain so until the end of the age, until Jesus comes and sets up his kingdom. Jesus himself warned his disciples that they would face persecution. Remember, before he went to the cross, he warned them that the world would hate them. Why would the world hate them? Because they hated Jesus first. If they hated Jesus, they're going to hate you. Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 3:12, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will live a wonderful life free of hurt and pain and ease and comfort, right? That's not what it says? That's what Joel Osteen says, right? No, it says, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Well, that's a wonderful tagline. That's a great way to get people to come and join Christianity. And hey, come join us, and if you come live a godly life, you're going to face persecution. People are going to hate your guts. Come on, it's great. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 13, though, they say this, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you." Don't act like you're going under something. Don't act like no one else has ever gone through what you're going through. Don't act like no one else has faced the persecution you're facing. Don't think it weird that somebody doesn't like that you're a Christian. Don't think it's strange that someone doesn't like the fact that you live and try to live a godly life. Instead, verse 13 says, instead of thinking it's strange, do this. He says, but rejoice. Rejoice. Yeah, rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. Listen, we are going to face persecution. If you want to live a godly life, you're going to be targeted by the ungodly. Listen, this is the problem with many of our churches. Many of our churches, Satan and the world, they're not attacking. Why? They're not really filled with godly people. If we had our churches full of people trying to live godly lives and follow Him, we would find ourselves under a lot more attack than we are. Daniel's enemies, they're trying to find every way they can get to him. They are targeting him, and they were frustrated. They had tried to find some little chink in his armor, and they had failed because Daniel was a man of integrity. His track record was spotless. And so they realized there was only one way they were going to bring him down. They were going to have to use his faith and his devotion to God against him. By the way, do not be surprised as we keep moving forward in this society. The government is going to more and more attack us on what? On our faith and what we believe in God. That is how they're going to have to come after us. They did that with him. They knew they were going to have to use his faith and devotion to God against him. They knew by the way Daniel lived his life that if he had to choose between obeying the law of God and obeying the law of man, they knew from Daniel's life which law that he would choose to obey. He would choose God every time. And so these politicians, they do something unheard of in politician landscape. They put all their differences aside and they come together to all come together and say, we've got one thing we can all agree on. We don't like this guy Daniel. Let's get him out of the way. So they put their differences aside. They set out to devise a plan to trap the man of God. They are not looking to just humiliate him. They're not looking to just demote him. They are looking for a way to kill him. They want him dead. And so the conspirators come before Darius and present a united front. Notice what verse 7 says again. Here they are. They come before him. It says in verse 6 that they thronged before the king. That means they literally came in and just came rushing in at him. In verse 7, they come to speak before him and they tell him this. Here's what they say to the king. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute, make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, first of all, this statement starts straight up with a lie, doesn't it? Did all the governors, satraps, administrators, did all of them agree to this decree? No. Who didn't agree to it? Daniel. Daniel's one of the governors. And Daniel, I don't know, I often wonder what was going on with the king in this moment. Maybe he just got caught up with the pomp and the circumstance and this mad rush. Maybe he doesn't notice Daniel's there, but he takes their word for it. Here's this guy that he wants to promote to be over the whole realm, and they come before him and say, all the governors, but Daniel's not here. And he just assumes Daniel must be in favor if that's what they say. So it starts off straight up with a lie because not everyone was for this decree. Daniel certainly was not. And it's actually very unlikely that all 120 satraps knew what these men were doing. This was not a large group of men. This was a certain select group who had come before the king. But Daniel's enemies, listen, they're not going to let the truth get in the way of their agenda, right? Does that sound like any politicians you know? Truth? What's truth? My agenda is more important than truth. All right, anyway, they come and they were able to persuade the king to sign their declaration into law. And they did so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which did not alter. Listen, they did a masterful job of fooling King Darius. Verse 9 reveals that he signed the written decree. Why did he do this? Darius, I'm just going to tell you, the way they framed this, they framed it in a manner that this was meant to help King Darius solidify the kingdom. I know, and I've read that some people take this under that he was filled with pride and that he was viewing himself as a god here. They're going to have to come and to pray to me. I don't believe that was necessarily what he had in mind. When he talks about not praying to a god or a man, ultimately, you could pray to a man. Listen, we do it in the Catholic religion, right? You go and you pray to a man, basically, who intercedes for you with God. At times, you go into that confessional booth. But anyway, the point is, there are many religions where you come before a man, and that man prays before God for you. So ultimately, what they're saying is, hey, king, listen, you've just taken this over. You've got all these Babylonian gods. You've got all these gods, all of your gods. Here's what we need to do. We need to sign this decree so that anyone who wants to pray needs to come to you. You are going to be the conduit to the gods. You're going to be the conduit for 30 days. And that way, everyone will have to kind of come together and be forced into the and coalesce under your rule. It was actually a very brilliant plan, but he doesn't see exactly what's going on here. This was all a ruse, and the trap is now set. And what is Daniel going to do? They knew exactly what Daniel would do, and it's the same thing we must do, and that is this. Godly people must remain, actually, no, not must. Godly people remain faithful to God. Godly people remain faithful to God. It's kind of like Yoda says, there is no try. It's do or do not, right? I messed that up big time. I forget it, but oh well. Godly people remain faithful to God. Listen, when the culture came into conflict with his faith, Daniel chose God. He said, if I have to be faithful to one thing or the other, I'm going to be faithful to God over culture. Look at verses 10 through 15. Verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And the king answered and said, this thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. Listen, faithful Christian character is not forged the moment adversity comes. If you're waiting for adversity to come to suddenly have good Christian character and faithful Christian character, you're not going to have it. Faithful Christian character is revealed in the moment of adversity. Daniel soon learns of this new decree that is signed by the king, and how does he respond? He does what he has faithfully done every day of his life. He does what he has always done. He obeys God instead of man. He continues a pattern of spiritual devotion, a pattern that has been a defining characteristic of his life for years. It is a pattern his enemies knew well. He went home. He proceeds upstairs to his place of prayer where his windows are open towards Jerusalem. He gets down on his knees and he prays 3 times that day, giving thanks to God just as his custom had been since his early days in Babylon. Understand, sometimes we look at this and we wonder what's going on here. One thing Daniel's not doing, Daniel's not trying to make a show of it. He's not trying to create a public act of defiance. He's not trying to go out into the public square and say, I'm going to do an in-your-face moment, and I'm just going to publicly as I can, defy the order of the king. That's not what he's doing. Instead, what he is doing is he is making a public statement about the glory of God over Darius. He's not going out and trying to rub anyone's face in it, but he's not going to change who he is. He's not going to change his pattern. He's not going to change his faithfulness to his God. He's always publicly prayed to God, and he's not going to stop now. And so, he didn't do what some of us might have been tempted to do. How many of us, if we had heard the decree, would have said, you know what, maybe I should take a month off from my routine, right? I mean, it's only for 30 days, right? I can avoid this for 30 days. God will understand, right? If I change my habit and if I stop praying to him for 1 month. He could have done that. He didn't close his windows and go to a private room so no one would know. How many of us would have chosen to do it that way? Say, well, listen, that may be the law. I'm still going to pray, but I'll just close my windows and go down into the private room so that nobody will know I'm doing it. He could have done that, and some of us would have chosen to do that. He had honored God by praying in this room to God every single day of his life in Babylon. Let me ask you something. If he had changed his routine here, what would that have said about his faith in God? Everyone knew he did this. Everyone could see him 3 times a day bowing and praying to his God here in this room. What would it have said if the king's decree was issued and suddenly he starts closing the blinds? It would have said his faith wasn't that strong in God after all, right? Maybe he didn't really have that strong faith that he claimed he did. But he had honored God every day of his life, and he wasn't about to stop now. And Daniel's enemies were ready and waiting. They saw Daniel go up into his room. They saw him pray, and they immediately brought it to the king's attention. And suddenly Darius realized what these men have done. And the Bible tells us he was displeased with himself. Why was he displeased with himself? I think he realized he had just been had. I think it's in this moment he realizes these guys laid a trap for me and Daniel. And he is upset. He's displeased. He can't believe he did this. He stepped into this trap that these men had carefully laid. And he immediately begins looking for any way. There's got to be some way that I can spare Daniel from this fate. But these evil men, they come and they remind him, there's nothing you can do, king. He's guilty. He must die. He was bound to follow the law that he had signed. These men knew Daniel would stay true to his God. And he did. Daniel knew that past faithfulness was no substitute for present faithfulness. The past simply prepared him for the present and the future. But what a testimony of faithfulness. They knew Daniel would never be untrue to his God. Let me ask you this question. Do people see the same thing in you? Do people look at you and say, I know without a shadow of a doubt, they will never be untrue to their God? Do they look at Travis and say, Travis will never be unfaithful to his God? Can they look at you and say that? They looked at Daniel and they knew exactly what he would do. Next, we see this. We need to live a life that honors God. We need to stay true to God even when it has a cost. And third, we need to place all our trust in God. Just as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah showed total trust and confidence in God in chapter 3 when the fiery furnace was in play, Daniel has that same conviction and that same trust here in chapter 6. He knew he could trust God. And as we go through this life, we must do so with an unwavering trust in God as well. First, we have to do this. We have to trust in God's plan. Get it to go. We have to trust in God's plan. Look at verse 16 through 18. Verse 16. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Darius didn't want to throw Daniel in the lion's den, but he's got no choice. And as Daniel's about to be thrown in the pit, his friend, the king, spoke to Daniel, and he said, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Listen, when you listen to this phrase, and listen, the way it's written in the New King James, it sounds very definite, but there's a lot of hope in this statement. It's kind of a hope-so type statement. It's like, Daniel, I know you believe your God will do this. I know you believe your God, who you continually serve, will deliver you. But man, I really hope he does. I really hope that your God comes through. You can hear the concern and hope Darius has for his friend. But Daniel's not trusting the king's concern for his hope. He's not trusting the king's hope. He's trusting God's sovereign plan. Listen, when Daniel goes into the pit, he knew that whatever God chose to do was his divine prerogative. He knew that God's plan is always perfect. He wasn't stressed. He wasn't worried about being thrown in this den of lions. Whatever happens, happens. Whatever God has decreed will happen. I'll either live or die, but whatever it is, it's God's plan. It's God's purpose. Darius, however, while he hoped Daniel's God would deliver him, he didn't fully believe it. What does he do? He goes back to his room that night. He didn't trust God's plan, so he goes back to the palace, and he has what is probably the most restless night of sleep of his life. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. They wouldn't bring any of the musicians or instruments into him to help calm him down. He struggled all night long, wondering if those lions were tearing his friend piece to piece. This was possibly the longest night of his life. He knew he had been set up. And he realized it had cost him the life of a loyal and faithful man and friend. He didn't fully understand that this was all part of God's sovereign plan. To him, it doesn't make sense. But Daniel did. Daniel understood this is God's plan. And because of that, Daniel could trust in God's power. He could trust in God's power. Look with me at verse 19. I almost skipped to chapter 7. I was like, that is not the right verse. It's like, whoa, what happened here? I was about to start reading about beasts. Not the lions, but beasts. Okay, verse 19. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Listen, the same way, I love this. In many of the commentaries I read, there were so many comparisons of Daniel going into the pit, into the den of lions, and comparing that with Jesus going into the tomb and coming out. Listen, the same way Mary Magdalene went to the tomb of Jesus at first light, like we talked about this past Sunday, here comes King Darius, right? King Darius gets it's first thing in the morning. He's heading straight out there. And he approaches the pit that's holding Daniel, and as he approaches the den of lions, he cries out. You can hear the mourning. He doesn't expect an answer. He believes Daniel is dead, right? That's how he approaches. He's just hoping that somehow Daniel's God actually did it. And as he approaches, he cries out, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? You can hear the doubt in his voice. He's grasping for straws. He doesn't think he'll hear anything else but the purring of some satisfied, well-fed lions. And suddenly, and no doubt to his joyful surprise, Daniel speaks. And he says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me. Why? Because I was found innocent before him, and also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. You know, we read this whole chapter. Do you realize these are the only words Daniel speaks the entire chapter? These words right here. Daniel basically declares, King, my God is powerful. My God is more powerful than you can possibly imagine. My God did what you thought was impossible, O king. He came and he shut the mouths of these lions. He's the one who has kept them from harming me at all. King, I trusted God. I trusted his power, and I'm going to keep trusting him until the day I die. Now, there's an interesting statement here. What does it mean when Daniel says, I'm innocent before God, and I'm also innocent before you, O king? I've done nothing wrong before you. First, understand, he is not claiming to be sinless. He is not saying, I have never sinned, I've never done anything that offended my God. Instead, he's claiming that when the choice had to be made, he chose God over man. He chose God's law over man's law. So, in that regard, he was innocent before God. But secondly, unlike what the enemy had said, remember what the accuser said? O king, he doesn't pay you due regard. King, Daniel doesn't respect you. He doesn't respect you enough to obey your law, king. And Daniel is basically saying, hey, king, what those guys said, you know that's completely untrue. I have the utmost respect for you. I hold you in high respect, but king, God has a higher priority in my life. And so, before the king, he had done nothing wrong to the king. All he had done was honor God over king, but there was no disrespect ever towards the king. As a result of what Darius has seen and heard, Darius gets Daniel out of the pit. By the way, don't you love the imagery there? Rolling the stone away, pulling Daniel out of the pit alive. Daniel gets out of the pit, and the king then issues judgment on the ones who had accused Daniel. And he issues that they be brought along with their families and thrown into the lion's den. This time there was no mercy, and they were all killed by the lions before they even hit the bottom. That should serve as a grave reminder that there is a flip side to the salvation of God's people. The enemies of God will one day suffer the judgment of God. That's the dark side to Daniel's deliverance. Judgment falls on those who had sought to destroy God's man. They and their families suffered a terrible death. Herodotus, we look at that and we say, why would their children and their wives be thrown in? Herodotus tells us that punishing the entire family was actually common under Persian law. This was what you did. If you were going to punish the man, you punished the entire family. And the entire family died. It was a terrible end. While Daniel's God had delivered him, their false gods had no power to deliver them. So again, why did God allow all of this to happen? Why did he allow it to happen? We have to trust God's plan. So why was this part of God's plan? God was going to use this the same way he uses events in our lives. That brings us to this last point. If we're going to live like Daniel, we have to realize that God can use your life to impact unbelievers. Listen, Daniel lived his life in such a way that others saw the reality of the living God through his life. That was the consistent pattern of his life. He lived his life so that when people saw him, they saw his God. That's what he wanted people to see. He didn't want the credit for himself. He wanted the credit for his God. And so when people saw him, they saw his God. In chapters 2, 3, and 4, Nebuchadnezzar praises Daniel's God. And in each chapter, his praise for God increases in more reverent ways as each chapter goes. In chapter 5, Belshazzar offers no praise to God. And here in chapter 6, Darius offers a summary of the whole book in a song of praise. Look with me at verse 25 and 26. Then King Darius wrote, "To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end." Let's go ahead and read through to the end. "He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions?" So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. All right. Let me share with you two quick thoughts. I'm going to get you out of here, I know. First of all, God can cause unbelievers to acknowledge his greatness. Sometimes God does these things, allows these things to happen in our lives to produce a response from unbelievers. God can use your life to impact unbelievers to do things they never thought they would do. In this case, to acknowledge his greatness. Darius has clearly been impacted by God's miraculous deliverance of Daniel. In words reminiscent of the psalm, he writes to all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Listen, this decree, it's meant to be heard by everyone, everywhere. And he declares that everyone in his kingdom must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Listen, Darius recognizes that the greatness and superiority of Israel's God over any other God. And it has the effect of canceling out this edict that he had already made earlier. God used this event in Daniel's life to cause this great king to acknowledge and publicly recognize to everyone that there is no God that is greater than Daniel's God. Listen, when God does things in your life, he can use your life to cause unbelievers to look at you and say, "Wow, you serve a great God. I may not fully believe your God, but man, you say your God did this, that is incredible." And it brings attention to God. But secondly, God can use unbelievers to proclaim his glory. Again, we see that in these verses. Darius publicly recognizes and proclaims that Daniel's God is the living and the eternal God. His kingdom is the only kingdom that will never be destroyed. He is the only one who has no rival. But beyond that, he sees Daniel's God as a personal God who delivers and rescues. He's not just some far-off, distant God who's not interested in the affairs of man. He is here, he's interested, and he is invested on a personal basis with mankind. He's not limited in any way. He can do miraculous signs and wonders as he chooses, as evidenced by his rescuing Daniel from the power of the lions. In this chapter, it ends with God once again honoring his faithful servant. Here is this man who really wanted no part of leadership anymore. He's in his 80s. He doesn't really want to be in this anymore. And yet God continues to bless him, continues to honor his faithfulness. Just as he had blessed and honored Daniel under the Babylonians, he does so again under the Medes and the Persians. All right? That's where we finish. Next week, we move to the prophetic section, Daniel chapter 7. All right? We'll be getting into that. Daniel 7 is going to mirror a lot of what we read in Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, but there's some differences and some parallels, so we're going to get into that next week with Daniel 7.